I was sent as an interpreter into the Smoky Mountain country in May 1838 and witnessed the execution of the most brutal order in the history of American warfare. I saw the helpless Cherokees arrested and dragged from their homes and driven at the bayonet point into the stockades, and in the chill of a drizzling rain on an October morning, I saw them loaded like cattle or sheep into 645 wagons and started toward the west. So wrote former U.S. Army soldier John G. Burnett in a letter to his kids composed on his 80th birthday. They had berated him for information countless times before about the Trail of Tears and the Indian removal he was forced to take part in. Whether by trauma, guilt, or some untraceable emotion in between, he had always refused. That he did so is no surprise, especially given that before the removal he had been on friendly terms with a number of the Cherokee he was forced to exile. The Trail of Tears, as it is taught in museums, schools, and universities nationwide, was a blood-stained terror in which conditions were brutal and mortality was a statistical likelihood. Burnett witnessed it firsthand and by the side of his former friends who suffered from it. The sufferings of the Cherokees were awful, he wrote. They had to sleep in the wagons and on the ground without fire. I have known as many as 22 of them to die in one night of pneumonia due to ill treatment, cold, and exposure. Such descriptions only touch the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the horrific circumstances, both environmental and man-made, under which the natives marched in those days. Elaborative details, however, are frequently the subject of school lessons and singular pieces of research and often stray from a cause seldom covered. What did it take to reach the point of the Trail of Tears? What policies were enacted, what unjust appeasements were made, and who, if anyone by themselves, is particularly at fault? The answer, whether there is just one to be found or instead a whole wealth of them, littered with nuance and hesitations, lies in the years leading up to their removal. From the early age of George Washington's first presidency all the way to the twistedly cathartic tenure of seldom-known Martin Van Buren, the effects line up with undeniable continuity. They need only to be observed with hindsight and prudence and used as a caution against the unfounded prejudice prevalent both then and now. The United States affairs with the native Indians started out on well-intentioned footing, at least on paper. Upon coming into office, one of the earliest priorities outlined by George Washington, the country's first elected president, was a level-headed and just policy with the natives. The government of the United States are determined, he said, that their administration of Indian affairs shall be directed entirely by the great principles of justice and mercy. Alongside this declaration, Washington and his Secretary of State Henry Knox further elaborated upon the plan for tranquility with the natives in the early summer of 1789, arguing that with their sprawling claim on all lands east of the Mississippi River in the early post-American Revolution days, the previous Continental Congress had unnecessarily poked and prodded the natives. The claim was made on the basis that by supporting the British in the Revolution, the natives gave up their claim to what now was seen as American land, reasoning that neglected the distinct lack of actual tribal support during the alleged time period. The redaction of obviously ignorant claims was undoubtedly a noble deed. As would become evident in the ensuing years, however, waxing sentimentality is much simpler than making tangible progress. This reality was never truer than with the Indian-American affairs of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and Washington got glimpses of it early on, even before he was officially president. 2 years prior to the outlining of his native policy, the then-empowered Continental Congress had ordained the Northwest Ordinance, which in essence gave American settlers free rein to stake land in the Ohio Valley. As time went on, however, and Washington went from general to president, resistance arose from natives of the Western Lakes Confederacy, illustrating to Washington the need for treaty-making as the primary power for the president to use and the primary method for the government to help deal with Indian-related conflicts. This propping up of treaties, which was soon granted by Congress, became a pillar of Indian-American dealings in the future, albeit often to ineffective degrees. The introductory example of this was the treaty Congress made with 7 northern native tribes, the Chippewa, Fox, Iroquois, Miami, Ottawa, Sauk, and Shawnee, which was formed with intentions to protect lands belonging to the tribes but was ultimately unsuccessful in doing so. The tribes, seeing that legislation inked on a piece of paper hundreds of miles away would not be able to prevent land-hungry settlers from invading their land, took matters into their own hands, often retaliating violently. Thus began the process of the American government trying to maintain amiable relations with the natives while also doing its best to appease its own citizens, a dissonant effort that would persist over many years and administrations. In the early 1790s, Washington sent a legion of troops led by General Mad Anthony Wayne to neutralize the violent natives in the Northwest, a campaign that was massively successful and established peace, though temporary, in the region. At the same time, Washington had to deal with the 4 tribes of the South, the Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Creeks. 3 out of 4 of these tribes Washington regarded favorably and without problem, the one outlier being the Creeks, who were only lulled into agreeability after extensive negotiations over the Treaty of New York that provided protection for many native Georgian lands while also bolstering the attempt to assimilate the Indians into American culture. Despite this tentative calming of the tides, it became obvious to Washington and Henry Knox that keeping peace with the Native Americans while also catering to the ravenous land-seeking desires of settlers was quite the arduous undertaking. They maintained that protecting native land and sovereignty was key to integrating them into the growing American culture, but even those sentiments came with caveats. I believe scarcely anything short of a Chinese wall or a line of troops will restrain land jobbers and the encroachment of settlers upon the Indian territory, Washington wrote. Knox, seeming to echo the sentiment, said, "If the same causes continue, the same effects will, and in a short period the idea of an Indian this side of the Mississippi will only be found in the page of a historian." The monumental task of contending with the natives was passed down to John Adams in 1797 after George Washington established the precedent of vacating the position of president after 2 terms. Adams quickly laid the groundwork for his native policy, which revolved around 2 primary concerns: the threat of foreign alliances with the natives. Both Great Britain and France still held lands in North America, and Adams rightfully knew that the newborn nation he inherited could not withstand an offensive of either country corroborating with the natives, and the precarious tensions caused by ambitious settlers lingering along the U.S.'s western border. Like Washington before him, Adams spent much of his time in office trying to assuage the Native American resistance to Western expansion while simultaneously satisfying his own citizens. In a 1797 letter to the Cherokees in Tennessee, Adams encouraged the tribe to recognize the, quote, sincere friendship of the United States, but to also realize that his loyalties lay first and foremost with his, quote, white children, citizens of the United States. This in essence encapsulates Adams' overall attitude toward the natives during his presidency. On one hand, he seemed to seek just policy, at least on paper. In his inaugural address, he promised to promote, quote, equity and humanity for the Indian. But on the other hand, he was often paternalistic and flat out unreasonable to the natives, going so far as to disregard then-held treaties and establish the Indiana Territory in 1800, gifting over 250,000 acres to white settlers in the Northwest Territory where strife had been rampant only years before. Simply put, there was a dichotomy created between his wildly inconsistent views. On some days, he observed with apparent admiration the way in which the natives operated, and on others, he saw them as, quote, bloodhounds capable of committing unspeakable atrocities. By the time Adams left office in 1801, the American Indians were left in a state arguably worse than the one they had been in 4 years earlier, and with the passage of time had come the nationwide installation of an attitude towards the indigenous marked by condescension, cultural prejudice, and unfounded apprehension. Thomas Jefferson was the third man to assume the presidency, and his aspirations were seldom different from his predecessors. His first large aim was to tighten the bonds between the native tribes in the United States, both on paper and in morale. The threat of overseas power still loomed, and if a firm alliance could be established, then such concerns would be alleviated. His second goal was to continue native assimilation, pushing them to, quote, adopt European agricultural practices, shift to a sedentary way of life, and free up hunting grounds for further wide settlement. With these goals came often objectionable underlying strategies. First and foremost, it is clear now that as tensions grew between white settlers and natives unyielding in their control of land, Jefferson's frustration did as well. "Nothing will reduce those wretches so soon as pushing the war into the heart of their country," he wrote in 1776 as a member of the Continental Congress. "But I would not stop there. I would never cease pursuing them while one of them remained on this side of the Mississippi." Though such harsh sentiments simmered down to the seeking of peace and obtaining of lands by the time he became president, the goals were still lined with a willingness to abuse and exile natives from their long-held lands in the name of American interests. One of, if not the biggest shift in Indian policy came in the form of Jefferson's purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France, which expanded the United States' breadth nearly twofold and, more importantly, opened up land for expansion and exile. Combined with his ruthless but undeniably effective strategy of driving the natives into debt through trade, dues that could only be paid back through the cession of lands, the days of sovereign Indian lands east of the Mississippi were coming to a brusque and forceful end, and the prospect of a complete Indian extinction outside of designated lands and newly acquired territory was imminent. The native culture was continuously being effaced from a United States that hadn't yet celebrated its 40th birthday, and options were limited. In fact, there weren't really any at all. As the War of 1812 loomed on the horizon and his presidency was drawing to a close, Jefferson gave the Indians only one choice: assimilate into American culture or feel the wrath of the U.S. military. "The tribe which shall begin an unprovoked war against us we will extirpate from the earth or drive to such a distance as they shall never again be able to strike us," he warned tribal leaders in an 1809 meeting in Washington. "In time you will be as we are. You will become one people with us, your blood will mix with ours, and will spread with ours over this great land." Sell a country, why not sell the air, the clouds, and the great sea, as well as the earth? Such was the reaction of Shawnee leader Tecumseh to the Treaty of Fort Wayne, signed in late 1809, only mere months after founding father James Madison was sworn to the office as the 4th President of the United States. The treaty traded 3 million acres of land in Illinois and Indiana for annual subsidies and a mere $5,000 worth of goods. Fittingly, despite its nature and the outcry over it, the arrangement would not even be the largest of the 30 treaties signed during Madison's presidency, a tenure littered with behaviors toward the Indians that were inconsistent and often prevailingly lazy. The biggest advancements in the Indian-American interactions and issues came through the explosion of northern, southern, and western border tensions that had been building up in years prior. One of the chief instances of this was the 1811 Battle of Tippecanoe, a preemptive strike by the U.S. upon a native alliance with hopes of halting the westward expansion, in which the Indian coalition was obliterated. Though bloody, the battle pales in comparison to the bigger picture of the American Indian Wars, which involved ongoing conflicts like Tecumseh's War, the Creek War, and the First Seminole War. Despite how defining of Madison's presidency these wars might be, there was also an aura of half-hearted respect for Indian lands and an overarching palpable complacency. Warfare and violence was epidemic in his 8 years in office, but Madison seldom gave much lip service to the natives themselves. Though he was big on expansion, not unlike most Americans of the time period, he, quote, rarely spoke about Indians, said John Stagg, a history professor at the University of Virginia, as well as an editor of the papers of James Madison. On the face of it, Madison didn't appear to say much about the Indians. The assumption is that Madison's policy toward Indians was a continuation of what came before. Like Jefferson, he looked at a map and, seeing undefended frontiers, wanted to get land for the settlers and extinguish Indian claims. He also bore some degree of skepticism as to whether the coordinated methods of Indian integration would work, saying, quote, "There is a disinclination in human nature to exchange the savage for the civilized life. The Indian tribes have ever shewn an aversion to the change." One of the proposed solutions to the problem was a, quote, "amalgamation of culture spurred by encouraged intermingling and even intermarriage." Such suggestions, however, were viciously shot down by the American public, and Madison's presidency ended without much differentiation from previous office holders. There might have been hesitations with the methodology, but articulations of it on Madison's part were few and far between. Enter James Monroe, the fifth man to lead the young nation. Coming into office, Monroe was greeted with a nation recently let loose from the pressure of foreign powers after the War of 1812, and thus granted a sense of real, unmolested independence. Beginning with Monroe's presidency and including the next 10 years, this period was known as the era of good feelings. Naturally, this led to even more unabashed hungering for land among the settlers, and so continued the quest to obtain as much territory as possible and by any means necessary. During his presidency, which spanned from 1817 to 1825, Monroe saw 40 treaties signed with native Indian nations, 23 of them having to do with acquiring land. In addition to these legislations, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was founded in 1824. Despite having inherited such prosperous times, for the mass majority of white Americans at least, the issue of the natives persisted and often gave way to increasingly bloody conflicts. Perhaps chief among these was the ongoing battle in the south with the Seminole, who at that point were in alliance with colonists from Spain. After months of fighting, the battle was stymied when Monroe sent Tennessee-born General Andrew Jackson to assist in the fight against the Seminole, which he did with marked success, including the recapture of escaped African-American slaves who had found homes among the natives. Monroe, not unlike most of his predecessors, pressed the Indians to voluntarily leave behind the lands they had once rightfully held, offering them land in Arkansas if they obliged. Meanwhile, in western New York, similar land-oriented quarrels were present, as Monroe pushed for the Seneca Nation to compress down to one consolidated reservation in order to make way for the Erie Canal. When considering the domestic interests the demands held and their connotations for the U.S. as a whole, the effort surely seemed justifiable. The Seneca, however, were the largest nation within the Iroquois Confederacy and were spread over 11 separate reservations. A successful resistance ensued, led by Chief Red Jacket, who had been granted a Silver Peace Medal by George Washington 4 administrations earlier. "We had thought that all the promises made by one president were handed down to the next," Red Jacket lamented while donning the medal, speaking out against the blatant contradictions. "Now the tree of friendship, its limbs are falling off, and you were at fault." Regardless of his pleas, the Seneca were relegated to a different part of New York and eventually west of the Mississippi altogether. Monroe's views pertaining to Indian life as a whole were fairly dismissive. The solution he adopted to the U.S.'s conflict with the natives, again matching that of the unproductive men who came before him, was the full absorption of the Indians into American culture. "The earth was given to mankind to support the greatest number of which it is capable," he said in his first congressional address. "No tribe or people have a right to withhold from the wants of others more than what is necessary for their own support and comfort." This policy didn't always breed malicious destruction. Indian education was revolutionized during Monroe's presidency, albeit by mostly white Christian missions with the goal of cultural assimilation, but it rarely worked to the degree that it needed to. In the late stages of his presidency, Monroe relented that the government had largely failed to efficiently treat the Indian nations with respect that would keep relations tame while enforcing the relinquishing of lands at the same time. By the time he departed, he had grudgingly endorsed forced removal of the nations to lands west of the Mississippi. Experience has clearly demonstrated that in their present state it is impossible to incorporate them in such masses in any form whatever into our system, he remarked in an 1825 special message to Congress. "Their degradation and extermination will be inevitable." When John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams and possibly one of the most qualified men to ever take office, assumed the presidency, the Indian Springs Treaty was among the first things to greet him. The treaty was a colossal one, setting up the ceding of all Georgian Creek lands to the U.S. in exchange for less than $500,000 and an equal amount of land in the Louisiana Territory. Naturally, Adams signed the treaty, considering it had already passed through Congress. Soon thereafter, however, he was enlightened by ruffled tribal leaders on the true nature of the treaty and its conception, which was overwhelmingly unfair and was negotiated with a large unawareness of the terms on the native side. Taking the argument to heart, Adams changed his mind and began the fight for annulment, being blocked by Congress and drawing threat of military action by the state of Georgia in the process. It was eventually voided, but not for long. After the treaty was retooled by the Treaty of Washington in 1826, it was only the next calendar year that a third treaty was penned, once again demanding the Creed to give up all the lands in Georgia they held. This dispute was possibly the defining point of Adams' presidency. Beginning on day one, it led to an internal disillusionment with Indian policy that would follow him for the rest of his life. Despite signing 30 treaties during his time in office, many of them calling for land relinquishment, his hesitations were possibly the most pronounced of a president up to that point, and most certainly since George Washington 30 years earlier. He constantly struggled with the decision of subsuming Native Americans into the United States or relocating them to lands west of the Mississippi River and far outside of the ones they had held long before the idea of the U.S. had been conceived. Making the issue no better was Secretary of State Henry Clay, who foretold of Indian extinction within half a century, adding that, quote, their disappearance from the human family would be no great loss to the world. Despite his qualms with such a statement, Adams confessed in his diary that there was legitimate foundation in Clay's words. Sentiments like these often grace the pages of his diary. We have talked of benevolence and humanity and preached them into civilization, written in 1828, but none of this benevolence is felt where the right of the Indian comes in collision with the interest of the white man. The uses of the words right and interest stand out in particular. Over the years, as Adams recognized, the annexing of native lands in violation of their intrinsic rights based off the Constitution was often reconciled in the name of American interest alone. Perfectly summing up Adams' disposition towards the government's Indian policy was his reaction to being offered the chairmanship of the House Indian Affairs Committee in 1841, a vehement rejection punctuated by a diary writing, "It is among the heinous sins of this nation. I turned my eyes away from this sickening putrefaction and asked to be excused from serving as chairman of the committee." The election of 1828 brought to office a stark contrast in personality from the dubious John Quincy Adams in the form of Andrew Jackson, a former U.S. Army general who had led horrific and brutal attacks against the Creeks of Georgia and Alabama, as well as the Seminoles of Florida that resulted in over 100,000 acres of land being transferred to white farmers and settlers. It went without saying that, especially in comparison to previous men in office, Jackson was nearly unabashed in his apparent bias against the indigenous people, and at the very least was the most eager president thus far to relocate the natives west of the Mississippi. It therefore came as no great surprise that in 1830 the Indian Removal Act was passed, allowing the government to exchange land east of the Mississippi River for lands west of it, and, quote, Indian colonization zones located in what is now Oklahoma. The law wasn't as preposterous as it may superficially seem, dictating that treaties negotiated under the Act's legislative umbrella were to be done so, quote, fairly, voluntarily, and peacefully. These mandates, however, were frequently ignored by Jackson and the American government as a whole, who quickly began the process of demanding the ceding and vacation of Indian-held lands in the Southeast. Such violations did garner some resistance. Namely, the Supreme Court ruled in 1832 with Worcester v. Georgia that native lands were sovereign nations, quote, in which the laws of Georgia and other states can have no force. It seems as if there might be some backing by the U.S. on the part of resisting natives who were doing no more than holding onto the lands they had owned for countless years. Jackson's response? John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. In a move synonymous with his character, Jackson bucked the idea of judicial review in the United States, which today is a pillar of the court of law and the overall name of justice. In the words of an anonymous political journalist, if the courts cannot decide that a law is incongruous with the Constitution, then who can? The politicians who made the law? Regardless, the injustices continued from there, with commencement of the native removal soon taking place. The forced exodus took place over the remainder of Andrew Jackson's presidency, which ended in 1836, and into that of Jackson's vice president, Martin Van Buren. Though notably less conspicuous than the men before him, Van Buren's time in office bore greater stains of sanguinary Indian removal. In fact, most of the carrying out of the Indian Removal Act took place under his watch. The conditions of the removal, as alluded to, were horrific. Along a trail that totaled over 5,000 miles across the southeast, various Indian tribes were taken away from their lands and forced to march to their new designated territory in the west. Along the, quote, Trail of Tears, dubbed as it is because of the trials and heartaches it entailed, diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhus were rampant, as well as starvation and overall minimal well-being. Between the presidencies of Jackson and Van Buren, nearly 9,000 native deaths were estimated to occur by way of the Trail of Tears alone. In the early parts of the decade, there were 125,000 Indians residing in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. By the time it came to an end, however, there were few natives to be found across the entirety of the Southeast. The exile of the indigenous from their lands had finally been accomplished. To select a guilty party for the native banishment is no simple task. Naturally, one's gaze locks on Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, who legislated the biggest part of the removal and carried it out respectively. But what about Thomas Jefferson, who purchased the Louisiana Territory and made such a forced deportation possible? Or perhaps even George Washington, who, though in the name of protecting American citizens, set the precedent for using military force against the natives? The process in reality is more akin to a line of precariously set dominoes than anything else. Furthermore, was there a realistic alternative? Nearly 2 centuries down the line, we can look back and observe the atrocities committed against an entire people, condemning them as acts of belligerent prejudice. But nuance remains. The natives, obviously the victim party, were not completely innocent of reciprocating violence or even initiating it themselves. And as American presidents, were these men responsible for upholding the well-being of a species foreign to them, or serving the interests of the people who elected them to office in the first place? Regardless of the morality of the question, the early American settlers were ruthless and uncaring of the Indian cause. George Washington may well have prophesied the coming doom when he said nothing could hold ravenous expansionists back. When put in the same position as these presidents, with our backs against the wall and being forced to quench the bloodthirst of the people or face public outrage, who can say we would have acted otherwise? In the end, the chronology of the Trail of Tears serves as a picture of how cultural ignorance can snowball from wanting a piece of land belonging to someone else, all the way to the governmental legislation of expatriating an entire race of people. Regardless of right or wrong, good or bad, or all the disillusionment and nuance in between, the 50-year mosaic of bloodshed, strife, and racial tension provides a clear lesson to be learned both now and for many years to come.